Hello and welcome. Imagine standing beneath a sky forever scorched to crimson, where the sun beats down with such merciless intensity that the very air shimmers and warps before your eyes. You feel the sand beneath your feet, each grain heated to the point of burning, and you understand that this world, this dying sphere called Athas, has known horrors beyond your darkest nightmares. But among all the terrors that have walked this parched and bleeding land, none compare to the creature you are about to discover. His name was Borys, though that human name would eventually become meaningless, swallowed by something far more terrible. You know him better as the Dragon of Tyr, the Dragon King, and his story is written in the blood of millions, carved into the very bones of this world. Before you can understand the monster, you must first know the man. Borys was not born a dragon. He was not hatched from some ancient egg, nor did he crawl from the depths of the earth as some primordial beast. No, Borys began as you might have begun, as human flesh and blood, with thoughts and dreams, and perhaps even hopes for a future that would never come. But this was thousands upon thousands of years ago, in an age when Athas itself was different. Historical records indicate that the world still had oceans, that forests grew where now only desert remains, that life existed in abundance that would seem impossible to anyone who knows only the current wasteland. Whether this age was truly paradise or simply less hostile than what came after, the contrast with modern Athas remains stark. The exact circumstances of his birth remain shrouded in the mists of deep time, lost to history like so much else from that ancient age. What fragmentary records exist suggest that Borys must have possessed something extraordinary from the very beginning. Though the specifics of his early life are largely lost to us, based on what we know of Rajaat's selection process for his champions, we can infer that Borys showed remarkable aptitude for both arcane arts and mental disciplines, enough to catch the attention of the most powerful being to ever walk Athas, the First Sorcerer himself, the one called Rajaat. Rajaat, even now, millennia after his imprisonment, that name carries weight enough to make the strongest tremble. Historical accounts confirm that he was the discoverer of magic, the first to pull power from the life force of living things, and he harbored an obsession that would damn the entire world. Rajaat looked upon the races that populated Athas and saw them as impure, as corruption that needed to be scoured away, so that his beloved halflings, the original inhabitants of this world, could reclaim what he believed was their ancient birthright. To accomplish this vision, he needed weapons, living instruments of destruction that could carry out genocide on an unprecedented scale. You must understand that Rajaat did not simply recruit followers or gather an army. No, his method was far more insidious, far more permanent. According to the accounts that survived from those who later learned the truth, Rajaat took individuals of exceptional promise, people like Borys, who showed remarkable aptitude for both magic and psionics, and he transformed them through dark rituals and forbidden knowledge through processes that would shatter lesser minds. Rajaat created his champions. These were not merely powerful wizards or skilled warriors. They were living weapons, each one specifically designed and empowered to eradicate an entire race from existence. Borys received a terrible honor in this grand design. Rajaat named him champion and gave him a title that would echo through the ages: the Butcher of Dwarves. You feel the weight of those words, don't you? Not the warrior against dwarves, not the opponent of dwarves, but the butcher. The very name tells you everything about what Rajaat expected, what Borys was meant to become, his sole purpose. The reason for his transformation and empowerment was to hunt down every dwarf on Athas and end their existence forever. The cleansing wars began, and with them, an age of slaughter that defies comprehension. Historical records from this period are fragmentary, corrupted by time and intentional destruction. But what remains paints a picture of vast armies marching across lands that still knew some measure of life. These armies did not fight for territory or resources or noble causes. They fought for extermination, pure and simple. And at the head of these forces marched the champions, beings who had been elevated beyond normal human limitations, granted powers that made them nearly godlike in their destructive capabilities. Borys threw himself into his appointed task with what accounts suggest was exceptional fervor. The dwarven people of Athas, renowned for their stubborn determination and focus, for their ability to dedicate themselves completely to any task they set their minds to accomplish, found themselves facing an enemy who appeared to possess those same qualities twisted into something monstrous. Where dwarves might focus on building a magnificent structure or crafting a legendary weapon, Borys focused on killing, on hunting, on the complete and total annihilation of their kind. You need to understand the scope of what this meant. The dwarven civilization was not small or scattered. Based on what we know from archaeological evidence and surviving records, the dwarves had built cities, established trade networks, created works of art and engineering that stood as testaments to their skill and dedication. They had families, children who played in streets paved by their ancestors, elders who passed down traditions stretching back generations. They had hopes and dreams and futures they believed would come to pass. Borys took all of that away. The historical record confirms that village by village, city by city, he carved a bloody path through dwarven lands. His magic allowed him to pull life force directly from living things, a practice you now know as defiling, leaving ash and death in his wake. Based on what we understand of champion powers, his psionic abilities would have let him break minds before he broke bodies, crushing resistance before it could even form. And he did not work alone. Records suggest he commanded armies of soldiers, other magic users who had learned from Rajaat, though they had not been elevated to champion status, and countless others who saw opportunity in serving such a powerful master. The dwarves fought back, of course. Their focus, that legendary trait that defined their race, meant they could not simply surrender or flee. When a dwarf sets themselves to a task, they pursue it until completion or death, and the task of survival became their focus. But how do you fight a champion? The question haunts the historical record. How do you stand against someone who can drain the life from entire areas to fuel a single spell? Who can shatter your mental defenses and turn your own thoughts against you? Who commands magic and psionics in combination that no ordinary being could hope to counter? The answer, terrible and final, was that you could not. Historical accounts suggest that individual dwarves might have landed blows, might have even killed some of Borys' soldiers, or disrupted his plans momentarily. Entire dwarven armies threw themselves against him in desperate, last stands that, based on the archaeological evidence of certain battle sites, must have been fierce beyond imagining. But Borys was no ordinary enemy. The pattern that emerges from studying this period suggests that every battle made him stronger as he refined his techniques, learned new ways to kill more efficiently, discovered how to counter every defense his victims erected. He was not just fighting a war. He was perfecting the art of genocide. Years became decades, decades became centuries, and still the cleansing wars raged on. The other champions pursued their own terrible goals with varying degrees of success. Some, based on what we can piece together, found their assigned races easier to track and eliminate, while others struggled against more numerous or better defended populations. But Borys, the Butcher of Dwarves, earned his title over and over again through sheer, relentless slaughter that the historical record confirms in site after site of dwarven ruins. You might wonder what this did to him, to the man beneath the title and the power. Did he feel remorse as he stared at the ruins of yet another dwarven city, smoke rising from buildings where children had died in their beds? Did he question Rajaat's vision as he watched his magic reduce whatever lands still had life to lifeless ash? The historical records provide no clear answer to these questions, but what we can infer from his later actions suggests that if such doubts ever existed, Borys buried them deep beneath the weight of his purpose. He had been made into a weapon, and the pattern of his behavior during this period implies a being who did not question why he was wielded. But understand this clearly, based on everything we know about the champions. Borys was not merely following orders like some mindless automaton. The very qualities that made him worthy of selection, that made Rajaat choose him above countless others, suggest he possessed intelligence, cunning, and a will powerful enough to have attracted attention in the first place. The archaeological and historical evidence shows tactical decisions, formed strategies, chosen moments to strike for maximum effect. The butchery was not random or thoughtless. It was calculated, planned, executed with a precision that made it all the more horrifying. Every dead dwarf represented a choice he made, an action he took, a consequence he accepted. The transformation Rajaat worked upon him did more than just grant power. What we understand of the champion creation process suggests it changed Borys fundamentally, rewrote aspects of his very being to make him a more perfect instrument of destruction. His body would have become more resilient, harder to injure, capable of recovering from wounds that would kill normal humans. His mind would have expanded, able to hold vast amounts of knowledge about magic and psionics simultaneously, to cast multiple spells while maintaining psionic disciplines, to process combat situations with inhuman speed and accuracy. Yet for all this transformation, for all the power Rajaat poured into creating his champions, Borys remained fundamentally human in one crucial way. He could still think, still plan, still desire things beyond his assigned purpose. And as the cleansing wars dragged on, as centuries of slaughter piled atop centuries of death, something began to change in how Borys viewed his situation. Historical accounts confirm that he was not alone in this. The other champions, those fellow instruments of genocide, began to have their own thoughts, their own conversations away from Rajaat's ever-watchful gaze. They spoke in whispers at first, these champions who had been given the power of demigods. What we can piece together from later testimonies suggests they compared notes on their campaigns, shared magical discoveries, discussed the state of the world beyond their assigned genocides, and slowly, carefully, a dangerous idea began to form among them. What would happen when the cleansing wars ended? When every designated race had been wiped from Athas, when Rajaat's vision was complete, what then? Would the First Sorcerer simply dismiss them, his living weapons, having no further use for their services? Borys participated in these discussions, added his own voice to the growing concerns. This much is confirmed by the records of what came after. He had spent lifetimes becoming the perfect killer of dwarves, had accumulated power and knowledge that few beings could match. The inference we can draw from his subsequent actions suggests that the thought of simply being cast aside, or worse, of being unmade as thoroughly as he had unmade countless others, did not sit well with him or his fellow champions. They had tasted godlike power. They had ruled over armies and commanded magic that could reshape landscapes. The idea of returning to anything less would have been intolerable. You see the seeds of betrayal being planted, don't you? The very qualities that made them such effective champions. That focus and determination and refusal to accept defeat. Those same traits led them to question their master's ultimate plans. And in questioning, they found doubt. And in doubt, they found the first stirrings of rebellion. But rebellion against Rajaat was not something to be undertaken lightly. He was the first sorcerer, the discoverer of all magic, a being whose power dwarfed even that of his champions. Fighting him directly would be suicide. No, if they were to move against their creator, they needed a plan far more subtle, far more complex than anything they had conceived before. They needed a way to catch him unaware, to strike when he was vulnerable, to use his own power against him. What the historical record confirms is that Borys became central to this conspiracy. His analytical mind, honed by centuries of strategic warfare, helped shape the plot that would eventually bring Rajaat low. Together with other champions, particularly those who would later become the Sorcerer Kings, Borys began to explore possibilities that would have been unthinkable before. They researched ancient magics, delved into secrets Rajaat himself might not have fully explored, sought out artifacts and knowledge that could give them the edge they would need. And all the while, they continued their assigned tasks. The evidence is clear on this point. Borys kept hunting dwarves, kept reducing their cities to ruins, kept playing his role as the butcher. To show any sign of hesitation, any hint of rebellion would alert Rajaat and doom them all. So the genocide continued, even as its perpetrators plotted against the one who had commanded it. The dwarven people suffered, not knowing that their tormentor was, in some twisted way, suffering his own crisis of purpose. The man who had once drawn his first breath in what accounts suggest was a greener and more living world, who had been selected by Rajaat for his potential, who had been transformed into a champion and tasked with genocide, now stood at a crossroads. Ahead lay a path of betrayal, of striking against the very being who had given him such terrible power. But to do nothing was to accept an uncertain fate at Rajaat's hands. When the cleansing wars finally ended, Borys, the butcher of dwarves, made his choice. Historical records confirm that he would betray his creator. He would turn against Rajaat, and in doing so, he would set in motion events that would transform him into something even more terrible than a champion. He would become the Dragon of Tyr, a creature of such immense power and madness that his name alone would inspire terror for millennia to come. But that transformation, that final metamorphosis into something beyond human comprehension, first required the successful execution of the most daring conspiracy in Athas's long and bloody history. The stage was set. The players had taken their positions, and you stand now at the threshold of understanding how a weapon became a traitor, how a traitor became a dragon, and how a dragon became the most feared being on a world already drowning in fear. Section 2. The Great Betrayal and First Metamorphosis. The conspiracy took shape slowly, like a shadow growing longer as the sun descends toward the horizon. You must understand that the champions did not wake one morning and decide to overthrow their master. No, what the historical record suggests is that this was a plan born from hundreds of years of careful observation, of whispered conversations in the dead of night, of coded messages passed between beings who had spent millennia learning to trust no one. Borys, the butcher of dwarves, found himself working alongside champions he had once viewed merely as fellow weapons in Rajaat's arsenal. And together, they began to weave a web of treachery that would reshape the fate of Athas forever. The greatest challenge they faced was not gathering the courage to betray Rajaat. That decision, once made, became almost easy compared to the practical problem that loomed before them. How does one imprison a being of nearly unlimited power? Rajaat was the first sorcerer, the discoverer of magic itself, a creature whose understanding of the arcane arts dwarfed even their considerable knowledge. He had created them, had poured power into their very beings, had shaped them into living weapons. Based on what we understand of such transformations, he would have built in safeguards, ways to unmake them if they ever turned against him. But the champions possessed something Rajaat perhaps had not fully anticipated: the ability to think beyond their programming, to innovate and discover new applications of the magic he had taught them. And they had access to something else, something that would prove crucial to their plan. Historical records confirm that deep in the world, hidden away in places of power, there existed artifacts from ages past, relics from the Blue Age when halflings ruled Athas and the world was young. Among these ancient treasures, the conspirators learned of one item that seemed almost designed for their purposes: the dark lens. You need to picture this artifact in your mind. According to the descriptions that have survived, it was not some simple bauble or minor magical trinket. The dark lens was a device of staggering power, an obsidian orb of perfectly crafted crystal that could focus and amplify magical energies to degrees that would shatter ordinary implements. Its origins stretched back to the time before even Rajaat's rise, created by hands now turned to dust. For purposes the current age could barely comprehend, but what mattered to the champions was not where it came from, but what it could do. The dark lens could take the combined magical power of multiple beings and channel it, focus it, transform it into something greater than the sum of its parts. With this device, the champions believed they could generate enough raw magical force to create a prison that even Rajaat could not escape. But obtaining the dark lens would not be simple. Based on what fragmentary accounts exist, it was guarded, hidden, protected by wards and creatures that would destroy anyone attempting to claim it without proper authority. The champions would need to move carefully, to plan each step with precision, because any mistake could alert Rajaat to their intentions. Borys took a leading role in this conspiracy, not because he commanded the others, but because his strategic mind and centuries of military experience made him invaluable in planning such a complex operation. What we can piece together from later events suggests he helped coordinate the champions' movements, ensuring that they continued their assigned genocides with enough vigor to avoid suspicion, while simultaneously working toward their goal. It was a delicate balance, maintaining the facade of loyal service while plotting ultimate betrayal. The champions moved in secret, gathering resources and knowledge they would need for the confrontation to come. The accounts that survived suggest they researched binding spells, studied prison magics, explored ways to trap a being in a space outside normal reality. They cultivated alliances with powerful beings who had their own reasons to see Rajaat contained. And slowly, piece by piece, they assembled everything they would need for the moment of truth. That moment came after thousands of years of the cleansing wars, when the world had already been scarred beyond recognition by the champions' genocidal campaigns. The historical record is clear on this. The lush forests had given way to scrubland, the scrubland to desert, as the practice of defiling magic drained the life force from the land itself. The oceans had begun to recede, transforming into seas of silt, as the water that sustained them was pulled away by climatic changes wrought through magical devastation. Athas was dying, and still the champions fought on. Still they pursued their assigned tasks. But the time for open warfare was ending. The conspiracy was ready. The champions had secured the dark lens, had prepared their spells and rituals, had chosen the moment when they would strike. And when that moment arrived, accounts suggest they moved with the same precision and ruthlessness they had displayed against their assigned races. Rajaat, the First Sorcerer, the being who had given them power beyond mortal comprehension, suddenly found himself facing the united might of his own creations turned against him. The battle that followed defies easy description, though those who later learned of it attempted to capture its magnitude. Imagine forces of magic clashing with such intensity that reality itself buckled and warped under the strain. Rajaat was powerful, more powerful than any single champion, perhaps more powerful than several of them combined. But historical records confirm he was not more powerful than all of them working in concert, their energies channeled and focused through the dark lens. The champions had learned from their master, had grown beyond his initial expectations, and they used every scrap of knowledge and power they possessed. What accounts exist suggest that Borys stood at the forefront of this confrontation, not because he was necessarily the strongest, but because he had accepted the burden of what must come next. The champions needed more than to simply defeat Rajaat. They needed to imprison him forever, to place him somewhere he could never escape, never threaten them or their new order. And they needed someone powerful enough to maintain that prison, to serve as its guardian and ensure the First Sorcerer remained bound for all eternity. The ritual they enacted was not merely a spell, but a fundamental alteration of reality, using the dark lens to amplify their combined might. The historical record indicates the champions' tour open a space outside of normal existence, a pocket dimension beyond time and space where Rajaat would be held. They bound him with chains of pure magic, wrapped him in wards that would hold for thousands of years, and sealed him away from Athas. But maintaining such a prison would require constant attention, continuous application of power to keep the bindings strong and prevent Rajaat from escaping. Borys volunteered, or perhaps was chosen, or maybe some combination of both, to become that guardian. What the records make clear is that he could not maintain Rajaat's prison as he was, merely a champion. He would need more power, vastly more power, enough to stand alone against their former master should the bindings ever weaken. And so the champions, having just used the dark lens to imprison Rajaat, prepared to use it again for an even more audacious purpose. They would transform Borys into something that had never existed before on Athas. They would make him into a dragon. You must understand that dragons, as you might know them from other worlds, did not exist naturally on Athas. The transformation into a dragon was not some inevitable evolutionary process, but rather a magical metamorphosis that represented the pinnacle of both arcane and psionic mastery. Based on what scholars have pieced together about this process, defilers who pursued power to its ultimate conclusion could begin this change. But it was a process that normally took centuries, even millennia, advancing through stages of transformation that slowly altered both body and mind. Each stage granted greater power, but also required greater sacrifice, demanded more life force drained from the world, pushed the defiler further from their original humanity. What the champions planned for Borys was to accelerate this process dramatically, to pour enough power into him through the dark lens that he would undergo multiple stages of dragon transformation simultaneously. The historical evidence suggests they knew this was dangerous. They understood that such a rapid metamorphosis might have consequences they could not predict. But they had just betrayed and imprisoned the most powerful sorcerer in existence, and they needed Borys to be powerful enough to keep him there. The ritual began, and you can only imagine the energies involved based on what the aftermath revealed. Every remaining champion contributed their power, channeling it through the dark lens into Borys' body and mind. According to the accounts of what came after, his form began to change, to expand, to transform into something monstrous. Bones lengthened and thickened, skin hardened into scales, muscles bulged with supernatural strength, his face elongated into a snout filled with fangs, his hands twisted into claws capable of rending stone. Wings erupted from his back, vast leathery appendages that could carry his increasing bulk through the air. But the transformation went beyond merely physical. What we understand of dragon metamorphosis suggests that Borys' magical and psionic abilities exploded in power, growing exponentially as the dragon nature infused every part of his being. He could feel his mind expanding, able to perceive and manipulate energies that had been invisible to him before. The defiling magic that had once required concentration and effort now came as naturally as breathing. Psionic disciplines he had spent centuries mastering became trivial. Child's play compared to the new heights of mental power he now commanded. Yet something went wrong. The exact cause remains a matter of scholarly debate, but the consequences were undeniable. Perhaps it was the speed of the transformation. Too much change happening too quickly for any mind to process. Perhaps it was the sheer amount of power being channeled through a single being, more magical energy than was ever meant to flow through one vessel. Or perhaps it was the price of the betrayal itself, some fundamental breaking of bonds that had held Borys together as a person, whatever the cause. As the transformation completed, as Borys became the first true dragon Athas had ever seen, historical records confirm that his mind shattered. The madness came upon him like a force of nature. Everything that had made him Borys, the champion, the strategist, the leader of the conspiracy, all of it was swept away in what accounts describe as a torrent of rage and confusion and primal, animalistic fury. He could no longer remember why he had wanted this transformation, could barely remember his own name. All that remained was hunger and anger, and an overwhelming urge to destroy everything in his path. The other champions, exhausted from the ritual, weakened from pouring so much of their power into Borys's transformation, suddenly found themselves facing something far more terrifying than Rajaat. The dragon they had created turned on them with what witnesses described as mindless savagery. They scattered, fleeing for their lives, as Borys began a rampage that would scar Athas for centuries to come. He started with his own city, the place called Ebb, where he had ruled before the transformation. Historical records confirm this much with certainty. The citizens who had served him, who had called him king, suddenly found their ruler transformed into an engine of destruction beyond comprehension. Borys fell upon them with unthinking brutality, his magic and claws and fangs reducing buildings to rubble and people to ash. Based on archaeological evidence from the site, he did not kill them for any purpose, did not drain their life force for some grand spell. He simply killed because the madness demanded it, because the rage inside him needed an outlet. When every soul in Ebb lay dead, when the city was reduced to ruins, Borys renamed it in what may have been a moment of terrible clarity that pierced through his madness. He called it Ur Draxa, which in the ancient tongues meant the city of doom. And then, according to what we can reconstruct from later accounts, he flew from that place, wings carrying his massive form out over the lands of Athas, seeking new victims for his insane fury. The other champions, now styling themselves sorcerer kings and claiming dominion over the remaining cities of the tablelands, watched in horror as the monster they had created ravaged the world. Historical accounts suggest they tried to fight him at first, gathered their forces, and attempted to bring him down. But Borys, in his dragon form, possessed power that exceeded their own, and his madness made him unpredictable, impossible to strategize against. He would attack without warning, destroy without reason, and then disappear to some unknown lair before they could mount an effective counterattack. Cities that had survived the cleansing wars found themselves obliterated by the Dragon of Tyr, as people began to call him. The archaeological record bears witness to this devastation. Entire populations were wiped out in single nights of terror as Borys descended from the sky in what survivors described as a fury of claws and magic. The land itself bore scars from his passing, vast stretches reduced to lifeless ash by his defiling sorcery. He was becoming the very thing the champions had feared Rajaat would become, an unstoppable force of annihilation that cared nothing for civilization or survival or the future of Athas. Years became decades. Decades became what historical sources suggest was at least a century. And still, the rampage continued. The exact duration remains debated among scholars, with some accounts suggesting the madness lasted for centuries, possibly as long as 1,000 years. What is certain is that the dragon seemed tireless, driven by a madness that never ebbed or faded. The sorcerer kings cowered in their cities, erected magical defenses, and prayed that his attention would fall elsewhere. The common people of Athas added a new fear to their already terror-filled lives, the knowledge that at any moment the dragon might appear and reduce everything they knew to dust and memory. But slowly, incrementally, something began to change. Deep within the shattered remnants of Borys' mind, beneath the madness and the rage, fragments of his original consciousness started to reassemble. Based on what we can infer from his later behavior, it was not a sudden awakening, not a dramatic moment of clarity where the madness lifted and he understood what he had become. Rather, it appears to have been a gradual process, awareness returning bit by bit, like light filtering through cracks in a wall. He began to have moments where he recognized places, where memories surfaced of things he had done before the transformation. The rage still dominated him, still drove him to destruction. But now there were brief interludes of lucidity where Borys could think, could remember, could begin to understand the magnitude of what had happened to him. And in those moments, one can infer that horror joined the madness because he could see what he had done, the devastation he had wrought across Athas in his insane fury. The other champions noticed the change as well. The dragon's attacks became slightly less random, slightly more purposeful. He began to return to certain locations, particularly to Ur Draxa, the ruins of his former city. They watched and waited, hoping that perhaps the being they had transformed was finally regaining enough sanity to fulfill his original purpose, guarding Rajaat's prison and serving as a check on their own ambitions. The historical consensus suggests the madness lasted for centuries, during which Borys raged across Athas as a mindless beast of destruction. Centuries of death and devastation, of entire civilizations ground to dust beneath dragon claws, of magic wielded with such abandon that it further accelerated the ecological collapse of an already dying world. Centuries during which the name Borys became a synonym for terror, during which parents would quiet crying children with warnings that the dragon might hear them. And then, gradually, painfully, Borys truly began to wake up. The madness receded enough for him to think coherently for extended periods, to remember his purpose, to understand what he had been meant to do. When he looked upon Ur Draxa, the city of doom he had created from the ashes of Ebb, accounts suggest he felt something that might have been remorse if dragons were capable of such emotion. He felt the bonds holding Rajaat, felt how they had weakened during his time of madness, and understood that he had nearly failed in his primary duty. The dragon of Tyr, no longer quite as mad, but still forever changed from the man he had been, settled into Ur Draxa to begin his true work. He would guard Rajaat's prison. He would maintain the bonds that kept the First Sorcerer locked away. And he would ensure that the other champions, now the Sorcerer Kings, remembered exactly who held the ultimate power in this new order they had created. But his sanity had returned too late to undo the damage, too late to bring back the countless dead, too late to restore what he had destroyed. What we can gather from the historical record suggests that Borys would spend the rest of his existence haunted by the memories of his rampage, forever marked by the centuries of madness that had transformed him from traitor to monster, to something that defied easy categorization. Section 3. 1,000 years of rage. You stand now at the edge of comprehension, trying to grasp what centuries of madness truly mean. The exact duration remains a subject of historical debate, with some sources suggesting hundreds of years, while others indicate the madness may have lasted as long as 1,000 years. What is certain is that for an incomprehensible span of time, more than most civilizations endure from birth to extinction, Borys raged across Athas as a force of nature more destructive than any sandstorm, more lethal than any drought, more final than the sun's burning judgment upon the parched earth. The madness that consumed him was not a simple thing, not merely anger or confusion amplified to monstrous proportions. Based on what we understand of dragon transformations forced at such impossible speeds, it was a fundamental breaking of his mind, a shattering so complete that the pieces could not recognize each other, could not remember what they had once formed together. Imagine your own consciousness torn apart and scattered, each fragment screaming in isolation, and you begin to approach an understanding of what Borys likely experienced. The dragon transformation, forced upon him at such impossible speed, had rewritten the very architecture of his thoughts. And in that rewriting, everything that made him recognizably himself had been lost. The first city to feel his fully unleashed wrath was Ebb, his own former domain, the place where he had ruled as a champion before the betrayal of Rajaat. Historical records confirm this much with certainty. You need to picture this city as accounts describe it: a center of learning and dark power, where Borys had gathered loyal Templars and Defilers, where trade routes converged and wealth accumulated despite the dying world around it. The citizens of Ebb knew their king was powerful, knew he had participated in something of cosmic significance. But archaeological evidence suggests they were not prepared for what came falling from the sky that terrible day. Borys descended upon Ebb without warning, without the mercy of an explanation or a chance to flee. What we can reconstruct from the ruins indicates his massive dragon form, still unfamiliar to him, still burning with the energies of transformation, crashed through buildings as if they were constructed of paper, rather than stone. His claws, each one longer than a tall man based on the marks left in stone, raked through crowds of people who had moments before been going about their daily lives. His tail, thick as a tree trunk and armored with scales harder than the finest metal, swept through what appear to have been marketplace stalls and merchant quarters, reducing commerce to corpses in a single casual motion. But it was his magic that brought the true horror. Borys had been one of Rajaat's champions, had spent thousands of years mastering the art of defiling, of pulling life force from living things to power his spells. Now transformed into a dragon, that ability magnified beyond all previous limits. When he cast spells in his madness, based on the evidence at the site, entire sections of the city simply ceased to exist, reduced to ash so fine it dispersed on the wind like gray snow. The ground itself died where he walked, a phenomenon still visible in the dead zones surrounding what would become Ur Draxa, with plants withering to nothing, insects falling dead, even the microscopic life in the soil extinguished in an expanding circle of absolute death. His breath weapon, described in accounts from those who witnessed later attacks and survived, was not ordinary flame. It was defiling fire, burning not just with heat, but with the essence of death itself, consuming the life force of everything it touched, and leaving behind not even ash, only a strange crystalline residue that marked where living things had been. Stone melted and ran like water. Metal vaporized. And people, those unfortunate enough to be caught in the path of his breath, were erased so completely that not even bones remained to mark their passing. The Templars of Ebb, those who had served Borys faithfully and benefited from his patronage, tried desperately to stop him. What fragmentary accounts exist suggest they gathered their most powerful spells, called upon the abilities their king had granted them through his connection to elemental forces, and hurled everything they possessed at the dragon ravaging their city. It made no difference. Borys was beyond their comprehension now, beyond their ability to harm. Spells that should have scorched his scales bounced off harmlessly. Psionic attacks that should have crushed his mind encountered a consciousness so shattered that there was nothing coherent left to damage. He killed them without even noticing they had tried to fight back, so far beneath his current power that they might as well have been insects attempting to move a mountain. When dawn rose the next day, Ebb no longer existed, where a thriving city had stood, where thousands had lived and loved and dreamed of futures now forever denied. There remained only ruins and ash and silence. Borys, in what may have been a brief flicker of something that might have been awareness, looked upon what he had done and spoke a single phrase, Ur Draxa, the city of doom. And then the madness reclaimed him fully, and he took flight once more, seeking new victims for his unfocused rage. The other champions, now calling themselves sorcerer kings and claiming dominion over their own cities, received reports of Ebb's destruction with mounting horror. Historical records confirm they understood immediately what had happened, what they had unleashed in their hubris. The dragon they had created to serve as Rajaat's jailer had instead become something worse than Rajaat himself could have been. At least Rajaat had purpose, had goals and plans and reasons for his actions. Borys had only madness and the terrible power to express it. They attempted to organize a defense, to pool their resources, and bring down the dragon before he could destroy everything they had built in the aftermath of their betrayal. Accounts suggest that Hamanyu, the sorcerer king of Uruk, gathered his armies and marched to meet Borys in open battle. You can imagine the confidence he must have felt, leading thousands of soldiers, backed by Templars and Defilers, believing that sheer numbers and tactical superiority would overcome even a dragon's power. What we know from historical records is that the battle lasted less than a day. Borys came upon them like a force of nature, his magic turning entire companies of soldiers to ash before they could even raise their weapons. Hamanyu himself, a champion of Rajaat and no stranger to slaughter, found his own considerable powers inadequate against the transformed Borys. He barely escaped with his life, and the survivors who managed to flee spread tales of the dragon's invincibility. Those tales grew in the telling until Borys became something more than a creature, became a living embodiment of death itself. Other sorcerer kings tried different approaches. Accounts suggest that Nibne, ancient and cunning, attempted to trap Borys with illusions and misdirection, to lead him into prepared ambushes where powerful spells waited to bring him down. But the dragon, even in his madness, possessed instincts and senses beyond mortal comprehension. The pattern that emerges suggests he detected the traps, avoided the ambushes, and when he finally caught Nibne's forces, he slaughtered them with the same mindless efficiency he had shown in Ebb. Nibne himself retreated behind the walls of his city and erected magical defenses that even Borys could not easily penetrate, choosing survival and isolation over any attempt at continued resistance. Historical fragments suggest that Abalach Ray, the sorcerer queen of Ram, tried diplomacy, sending emissaries to plead with Borys, to remind him of his original purpose, to appeal to whatever remained of his consciousness beneath the madness. The emissaries never returned. Their bodies were found days later, according to accounts from that period, scattered across miles of desert, bearing signs of death so violent that even hardened warriors turned away rather than look closely. The sorcerer kings learned, slowly and at terrible cost, that Borys could not be fought, could not be reasoned with, could not be controlled. All they could do was try to protect their own cities and hope that, when the dragon's attention turned their way, their defenses would hold long enough for him to lose interest and move on to other targets. It was a strategy of pure survival, abandoning any thought of defeating or containing the monster they had created. And Borys continued his rampage, roaming across Athas with no apparent pattern or purpose. Cities that had survived the cleansing wars, that had endured thousands of years of defiling magic and ecological collapse. found themselves erased from existence in single nights of terror. Archaeological sites across the tablelands bear witness to settlements that simply ended during this period, with no evidence of gradual decline or conquest, just sudden, total destruction. Small villages and towns, thinking themselves too insignificant to draw the dragon's attention, discovered that madness makes no distinction between important targets and trivial ones. Borys killed indiscriminately, destroyed without preference, left ruin in his wake wherever his shadow fell. The land itself bore scars from his passing that persist to this day. Vast stretches of territory that had been marginal but survivable were transformed into absolute wastelands where nothing could grow, where even the hardiest desert plants found no purchase in soil that had been defiled beyond any hope of recovery. The already receding seas of Athas shrank faster as the climate shifted further in response to the massive defiling Borys performed every time he unleashed his magic. The world, already dying, accelerated its slide toward complete ecological collapse, and modern scholars can point to specific regions where the devastation clearly dates to this period of the dragon's rampage. But perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the destruction itself, but what it represented. The champions had betrayed Rajaat because they feared what would happen when his cleansing wars ended, because they wanted to preserve some version of civilization on Athas, because they believed they could build something better than their master's vision of a world returned to the halflings. And in achieving their betrayal, in transforming Borys into the guardian who would keep Rajaat imprisoned, they had unleashed something that threatened to accomplish what even the cleansing wars had not: the complete extinction of all higher life on Athas. Years accumulated into decades, decades into centuries, and still the rampage continued. The people of Athas added prayers against the dragon to their daily rituals, begged their sorcerer kings for protection, lived every day with the knowledge that death might come screaming from the sky without warning or mercy. Cultural records from this period, fragmentary as they are, show that parents told children to be quiet, to not draw attention, because the dragon might hear them. Traders took longer routes to avoid areas where Borys had been seen recently. Entire populations lived in a state of perpetual terror, never knowing when their turn would come. But deep within the shattered fragments of Borys' consciousness, something was happening. The process was glacially slow, imperceptible from day to day, or even year to year, but based on what we can infer from his eventual recovery, it was occurring nonetheless. The pieces of his mind, scattered and isolated in the initial trauma of transformation, began to find each other again. It was not healing, not in any true sense. The damage was too profound, the breaking too complete for genuine repair. But consciousness is resilient in ways that even magic cannot fully account for. And Borys had been an exceptionally strong-willed individual before his transformation. The first signs were subtle, moments of hesitation before destroying a target, brief pauses where the dragons seemed to be thinking rather than simply reacting. The Sorcerer Kings, watching from their fortified cities, noted these changes, but dared not hope they meant anything significant. Historical accounts suggest that too many times before, they had seen what appeared to be patterns in the dragon's behavior, only to have those patterns dissolve into renewed chaos and destruction. But the changes continued, deepened. Borys began returning to certain locations, particularly to Ur Draxa, the ruins of Ebb that he had destroyed in the first moments of his madness. Witnesses who observed from a distance reported that he would land among the ruins and remain there for days at a time, not sleeping but not rampaging either, as if trying to remember something important, some purpose that eluded his shattered thoughts. These periods of stillness grew longer, more frequent, until the Sorcerer Kings realized that the dragon was spending more time at Ur Draxa than flying across Athas in destructive fury. How far into his madness this change began remains unclear, but what we can piece together suggests that after centuries of pure chaos, Borys had his first genuinely lucid moment, based on his later accounts to those few he spoke with. It lasted only minutes, a brief window where enough of his consciousness reassembled that he could think, could remember, could understand where he was and what he had become. The horror of that realization, the sudden awareness of centuries of mindless slaughter, was enough to plunge him back into madness immediately. But the window had opened, and once opened, it could open again. The lucid periods became more frequent, lasting longer each time. Minutes became hours, hours became days. During these periods, one can infer from his subsequent actions that Borys tried desperately to hold onto his awareness, to keep the madness at bay, to remember his purpose, and slowly, painfully, he began to succeed. He remembered Rajaat, remembered the betrayal, remembered that he was supposed to be maintaining the prison that held the First Sorcerer, preventing him from ever escaping and resuming his genocidal vision. At some point during this long recovery, Borys managed to maintain lucidity for an extended period. He used that time to examine Rajaat's prison, to assess the wards and bindings that had been placed upon the First Sorcerer. What he found terrified him, if later accounts can be trusted. The bonds had weakened dramatically during his centuries of madness, eroded by time and neglect. And the simple fact that maintaining such a prison required constant attention and reinforcement. Rajaat was still trapped, but he was closer to freedom than he had been since the moment of his imprisonment. This discovery gave Borys something his shattered mind desperately needed: purpose. The madness still gripped him, still pulled him toward destruction and rage. But now he had a reason to fight against it, a goal that transcended the chaos consuming his thoughts. He needed to maintain the prison. He needed to keep Rajaat contained. Everything else, including his own suffering, was secondary to that imperative. The madness receded incrementally over what may have been additional centuries, never disappearing entirely, but becoming more manageable, more containable. What we can infer from his later behavior suggests Borys learned to recognize when the rage was building, learned techniques to channel it in ways that did not involve destroying cities. Accounts from this transitional period mention sightings of the dragon in the most remote deserts, places where no one lived, unleashing his fury there and reducing lifeless sand to glass through the sheer intensity of his power. It was not a cure, but it was management, and management meant he could begin to fulfill his original purpose. By the time the madness could be said to have truly receded, whether that took hundreds of years or a full 1,000, Borys could think coherently, could plan and scheme and remember who he had been. The madness remained, always lurking at the edges of his consciousness, always threatening to overwhelm him if he let his guard down. But he could function, could work toward goals, could interact with others without immediately killing them. He looked upon Ur Draxa, the city of doom he had created from the ashes of Ebb, and made a decision that would shape the next age of Athas. This would be his seat of power, his fortress from which he would oversee both Rajaat's prison and the Sorcerer Kings, who had once been his fellow conspirators. The centuries of rage had ended, but their consequences would echo through the rest of Athasian history. Historical records make clear that Borys had killed millions in his madness, had accelerated the world's ecological collapse, had traumatized entire civilizations with the specter of sudden, inexplicable destruction. The Dragon of Tyr had earned his fearsome reputation through blood and ash, and no amount of returned sanity could wash away the stains of those years. But now, with purpose restored and mind reassembled from fragments, Borys could begin the work he had originally been transformed to do. He would guard Rajaat's prison. He would control the Sorcerer Kings. He would rule Athas from Ur Draxa, and the world would learn to fear him not as a mindless beast, but as a conscious, calculating intelligence backed by power beyond mortal comprehension. The age of the dragon's rampage had ended. The age of the dragon's rule had begun. Section 4. The Dragon King emerges. The transition from mindless beast to calculating ruler did not happen overnight, even after Borys regained his sanity. You must understand that centuries of madness leave scars that never truly heal, create habits and patterns that resist conscious control. Based on what we can infer from his subsequent behavior, Borys found himself constantly fighting against the urge to simply destroy, to give in to the rage that still bubbled beneath the surface of his restored consciousness. Every moment of clarity required effort, required vigilance, required the constant application of will to keep the dragon nature from overwhelming what remained of his original self. But Borys had always been a being of exceptional willpower, even before his transformation. That quality, which had attracted Rajaat's attention so long ago, served him well now as he worked to establish a new order on Athas. He looked out from Ur Draxa, the city of doom that stood as a monument to his madness, and began to consider what needed to be done. Rajaat's prison required constant maintenance, continuous infusions of power to keep the wards strong and the bindings intact. During his centuries of insanity, those wards had weakened dangerously, and Borys could feel how close the First Sorcerer had come to escaping. The magic required to maintain Rajaat's prison was not simple or easy. It demanded vast amounts of life force, more than Borys could provide even with his immense power. He needed a constant supply of living beings whose life energy could be drained to fuel the ward spells. Sacrifices on a scale that would have horrified any civilization that still possessed a functioning moral compass. But Athas had long since abandoned such luxuries. This was a world where survival trumped ethics, where necessity justified horrors that would be unthinkable anywhere else. Borys conceived of a system brutal in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. The Sorcerer Kings, his former fellow conspirators who now ruled the remaining cities of the Tablelands, would provide him with what he needed. Historical records indicate that each year, every city would send him slaves, living beings whose life force he would drain completely to power the magic keeping Rajaat imprisoned. The exact number varies in different accounts, with most sources suggesting 1,000 slaves from each city every single year, without exception or mercy. The calculation was coldly practical. There were multiple major city-states remaining in the Tablelands, and accounts generally reference 7 primary cities that participated in this levy system: Tyr, Uruk, Ram, Draj, Gulg, Nibne, and Balak. If each provided 1,000 slaves, as the most common accounts suggest, this meant thousands of lives consumed annually in the service of keeping Rajaat bound. Over a decade, the numbers reached into the tens of thousands. Over a century, hundreds of thousands. The figures accumulated into totals that defied easy comprehension. A perpetual sacrifice carried out one yearly levy at a time. You might wonder why the Sorcerer Kings agreed to this arrangement. Why beings of such immense power would submit to Borys's demands. The answer lies in the careful balance of threat and necessity that defined their relationship. The Sorcerer Kings feared Borys, had witnessed firsthand during his rampage what he could do when unrestrained. They knew that even working together, they could not defeat him in direct combat. His centuries of madness had demonstrated beyond any doubt that the Dragon of Tyr was the most powerful being on Athas, capable of destroying any or all of them if he chose to do so. But fear alone might not have been enough to ensure their compliance. The Sorcerer Kings also understood, because they had been part of the original conspiracy, that Rajaat's prison absolutely had to be maintained. If the First Sorcerer ever escaped, he would resume his cleansing wars with a vengeance born of millennia of imprisonment. He would not forgive the betrayal of his champions. He would not show mercy to the civilizations they had built in his absence. He would reduce all of Athas to ash and blood in his quest to restore the world to the halflings. And not even the combined might of all the sorcerer kings could stop him. So the levy system began, and it became the defining feature of life in the tablelands for what historical records suggest was approximately 2,000 years. Every city developed its own methods for gathering the required slaves, its own systems for determining who would be sent to their deaths, based on fragmentary accounts from various cities. Some used the levy as punishment for criminals and political enemies. Others selected from the slave populations they kept for labor. Still others raided outlying villages and settlements, taking people by force to meet their quotas. The slaves themselves, you need to understand, went to deaths beyond anything you might imagine as merciful. Borys did not simply kill them quickly. The process of draining life force for magical purposes was prolonged and agonizing, lasting hours or even days, depending on how efficiently he wished to extract their vital energies. Accounts from those who witnessed portions of this ritual, though such witnesses were rare, describe victims remaining conscious for most of it, feeling their own life essence being pulled from their bodies, watching themselves wither and age decades in moments, experiencing pain that had no physical source, but was no less real for its magical origin. And Borys performed this ritual thousands of times per year, according to the established system. You stand witness in your imagination to the sheer scale of suffering this represents, the screams that must have echoed through Ur Draxa every time the levy arrived, the terror of the slaves who knew what awaited them but could not escape, the cold, methodical efficiency with which Borys drained them one after another, channeling their life force into the wards that kept Rajaat imprisoned. The delivery of the annual levy became a ritual in itself, one that reinforced Borys's dominance over the sorcerer kings. What we understand from historical accounts is that they did not send mere servants or low-ranking Templars to deliver their quotas. No, Borys demanded that each sorcerer king personally oversee the delivery, bringing their slaves to Ur Draxa themselves, or sending their highest-ranking representatives. This forced them to witness what their tribute was used for, to see the dragon in all his terrible power, to be reminded year after year that they served at his sufferance. The journey to Ur Draxa was itself a trial. The city stood far from the tablelands, built in the wastes beyond the sea of silt, accessible only by the most dangerous routes across terrain that killed the unprepared. Bringing large numbers of slaves across such distances required significant resources and careful planning. The slaves had to be kept alive and healthy enough to be worth draining, which meant providing them with food and water during the journey, resources that were precious in the extreme on dying Athas. Some sorcerer kings resented this burden more than others. Historical accounts suggest that Kalak of Tyr, ambitious and always seeking ways to increase his own power, chafed under Borys's dominance and spent centuries plotting ways to accelerate his own dragon transformation. so he might challenge the Dragon King directly. Hamanu of Uruk, pragmatic and militaristic, accepted the levy as a necessary cost of survival and focused his efforts on making Uruk strong enough to weather any crisis. Records indicate that Lalali Pai of Gulk incorporated the levy into her people's religious practices, convincing them that those sent to the dragon were honored sacrifices rather than victims. But regardless of how individual sorcerer kings felt about the arrangement, all of them complied. The alternative, openly defying Borys and risking his wrath, was unthinkable. They had seen what he could do, had watched him destroy cities during his rampage, had barely survived their attempts to stop him. None of them wanted to face the Dragon of Tyr in single combat, to gamble their continued existence on the slim chance they might defeat him. Borys used this leverage ruthlessly to maintain control over the tablelands, despite rarely leaving Ur Draxa. He did not need to be physically present in the city-states to make his influence felt. The mere threat of his attention was enough to keep the sorcerer kings in line, to prevent them from expanding too aggressively or accumulating too much power. They ruled their individual cities as absolute monarchs, but above them all loomed the dragon, invisible but omnipresent, the true supreme power on Athas. From his fortress in Ur Draxa, accounts suggest Borys gathered intelligence through multiple channels. He maintained networks of spies and informants throughout the tablelands, beings who reported back to him on the activities of the sorcerer kings. Based on what we understand of his abilities, he possessed psionic powers strong enough to observe events from vast distances, to read minds, and extract information from unwilling subjects. And he had lived for thousands of years, had accumulated knowledge and experience that made him nearly impossible to deceive or surprise. The sorcerer kings learned that they could not keep secrets from the dragon if one of them began accumulating power too aggressively. If they started research into dangerous magics or attempted to accelerate their own dragon transformations, Borys would know. And knowing, he would act. Historical records suggest that sometimes his interventions were subtle, arranging circumstances that thwarted whatever plan was being enacted. Other times he was direct, appearing without warning to deliver threats, or in extreme cases, demonstrating his power in ways that left no doubt about the consequences of defiance. Ur Draxa itself became a place of legend and terror in the minds of the Tablelands people. Few ever saw it and returned to tell the tale. The slaves delivered in the annual levy certainly never came back. Even the sorcerer kings and their representatives spent as little time there as possible, arriving to deliver their quotas and departing immediately afterward. Those rare individuals who did visit and survive brought back tales of a city both magnificent and horrible, a place that combined architectural wonders with the unmistakable atmosphere of death and despair. What descriptions exist suggest the city had been rebuilt from the ruins Borys created during his initial rampage. but it was not rebuilt for normal habitation. Ur Draxa served primarily as the dragon's fortress and the gateway to Rajaat's prison. Its population consisted mainly of beings who served Borys directly, either by choice or by magical compulsion. There were no free citizens in Ur Draxa, no merchants or artisans pursuing their own interests. Everyone who lived there existed to support the dragon's purposes in one way or another. At the center of the city, according to accounts, stood structures of such immense magical power that even approaching them caused physical pain to those not properly warded. These were the gateways to Rajaat's prison, the focal points where Borys performed the rituals that drained the levy slaves and channeled their life force into maintaining the First Sorcerer's bonds. The architecture itself was woven with spells and wards, enchantments layered upon enchantments in patterns so complex that even master defilers who glimpsed them claimed they could study for years without fully understanding their purpose. Borys did not merely guard Rajaat's prison from the outside. Based on what we understand of his duties, he maintained constant vigilance against the possibility of escape, regularly inspecting the wards and bindings, reinforcing weak points before they could become serious vulnerabilities. This was not paranoia, but rather realistic assessment of the threat. Rajaat was the first sorcerer, possessed of knowledge and power that exceeded even Borys's considerable understanding. Given enough time and opportunity, Rajaat could conceivably find a way to escape, or at least weaken his bonds enough to influence events in the outside world. The maintenance rituals consumed much of Borys's time and attention, particularly in the period immediately after he regained his sanity. The centuries of neglect during his madness had allowed significant deterioration, and restoring the prison to full strength required extraordinary effort. The annual levy provided the necessary power, but channeling that power correctly, weaving it into the existing ward structures without creating new weaknesses, demanded both skill and constant focus. You see Borys in this role, the Dragon King sitting in judgment over all of Athas, maintaining the prison that holds back an even greater threat, extracting his terrible price from the Sorcerer Kings year after year, without mercy or apology. He had become exactly what the conspirators needed when they first planned to betray Rajaat, a being powerful enough to keep their former master imprisoned indefinitely. But he had also become something more, something they had not fully anticipated. He was the effective ruler of the known world, the ultimate authority to whom even sorcerer kings bowed. The other dragon transformations that occurred in the centuries after Borys's ascension only reinforced his supremacy. Some sorcerer kings, driven by ambition or desperation, attempted to undergo their own metamorphoses into dragon form. But historical records make clear that none of them matched Borys's power, because none had been transformed with the full cooperation of all the champions working together through the dark lens. Their transformations were slower, more controlled, but also more limited. They might gain some dragon characteristics, might increase their power significantly, but they remained fundamentally inferior to the dragon of Tyr. Borys watched these lesser dragon transformations with what we can infer was interest and calculation. He allowed them to proceed when it suited his purposes, intervened when they threatened the balance of power he had established. Kalak of Tyr, for instance, attempted to accelerate his own transformation by building a massive ziggurat and preparing a ritual that would drain the life force of the entire city's population. Historical records confirm that Borys did not directly stop this plan, but he did nothing to prevent others from doing so. When Kalak was assassinated and his ziggurat destroyed, the dragon of Tyr simply continued his eternal vigil. One potential rival eliminated without him needing to take direct action. The relationship between Borys and the Sorcerer Kings could be described as that between a distant overlord and tributary states. He demanded his annual levy and expected to be informed of major events, but otherwise interfered in their affairs only when necessary to maintain stability or prevent threats to his position. The Sorcerer Kings were free to wage war against each other, to scheme and plot and betray, as long as they did not threaten the fundamental order that kept Rajaat imprisoned and Borys supreme. This arrangement lasted for what sources generally agree was approximately 2,000 years, an entire age of Athasian history defined by the dragon's rule from Ur Draxa. Generation after generation of people lived and died knowing that their world was ultimately controlled by a being they would never see, that thousands of their fellow inhabitants were sent every year to deaths that served purposes beyond their understanding. The levy became simply another fact of life, like the burning sun or the scarcity of water, a constant that shaped society and culture across all the city-states. But Borys himself, behind the facade of untouchable power and eternal vigilance, carried burdens that would have broken lesser beings. The madness never truly left him, always lurking at the edges of his consciousness, always threatening to overwhelm his hard-won sanity. The memories of his rampage haunted him, images of the millions he had killed playing through his mind during quiet moments, and the guilt of the annual levy, if such a creature could feel guilt. The knowledge that he personally drained thousands of lives every year to maintain Rajaat's prison weighed on whatever remained of his conscience. Yet he continued because someone had to, because the alternative was worse than the terrible present. If he faltered, if he failed in his duty, Rajaat would escape and the cleansing wars would resume. Everything he and the other champions had fought for, everything they had betrayed their master to preserve, would be lost. The thousands of lives per year were a price he had decided was worth paying to prevent the extinction of all life on Athas. So Borys ruled from Ur Draxa, the dragon king in his city of doom, maintaining the prison that held back ultimate destruction, extracting his terrible tribute from a world already drowning in suffering. He was tyrant and guardian simultaneously, the source of annual horror, and the only thing preventing something even worse. This was his existence for approximately 2 millennia, until events set in motion would eventually lead to confrontations that would end the dragon's reign forever. Section 5. Power beyond mortal comprehension. You must try to envision what it means to be the most powerful being on an entire world. Not the strongest fighter, not the most skilled mage, but something that transcends such simple categories entirely. Borys, the dragon of Tyr, existed at a level of power that made ordinary distinctions meaningless. He was not merely a defiler who could cast devastating spells, not simply a psionicist capable of crushing minds with thought alone, not just a physical creature of tremendous size and strength. Based on all accounts that survived, he was all of these things simultaneously, each aspect of his nature amplifying and reinforcing the others in ways that created something qualitatively different from their sum. The dragon transformation that had shattered his mind for centuries had also elevated him to heights of power that no other being on Athas could match. But that transformation was not a single event, frozen in time. What we understand from studying dragon metamorphosis suggests it was an ongoing process, a change that continued throughout his existence, advancing through stages that brought new abilities and new changes to his form and nature. When the champions had used the dark lens to force multiple stages of transformation upon him simultaneously, they had pushed him far along the path to becoming a true dragon. But they had not completed the journey entirely. You need to understand that dragon metamorphosis on Athas follows a specific progression, divided into stages that practitioners of such dark magic have carefully cataloged and studied. Each stage brings the transforming being closer to the final form of a fully realized dragon. But each also demands terrible prices and brings its own dangers. Borys had been thrust through many of these stages all at once, achieving in moments what normally would take centuries or even millennia of careful advancement. The madness that resulted from such rapid transformation was the price he paid for that acceleration. But once his sanity returned, once he could think coherently again and exercise conscious control over his abilities, Borys found himself in possession of powers that defied easy categorization. His physical form alone, based on descriptions from those who witnessed him and survived, would have made him a terror beyond reckoning. Accounts suggest he stood somewhere between 30 and 50 feet tall when fully upright, though descriptions vary considerably, and the sheer terror he inspired may have affected such estimates. What remains consistent across all accounts is that his size alone made him a creature of nightmare, dwarfing even the largest mundane beasts. His body, according to witnesses who saw him from a distance, combined reptilian and mammalian features in ways that seemed designed to unsettle any observer. The basic structure was vaguely humanoid, two powerful legs that could propel him across the ground in great bounding strides. But everything else about him suggested something alien and monstrous. Historical descriptions, fragmentary as they are, paint a picture of a being that had moved far beyond his human origins. His skin had transformed into scales, and accounts describe them as harder than the finest metal, overlapping plates of organic armor that could turn aside weapons that would cleave through stone. These scales were not uniform in appearance, with witnesses describing variations in size and color, though the exact details differ between accounts. Some describe deep obsidian coloring, others mention bronze tones, and still others reference dark crimson markings. What seems certain is that his scales were formidable protection against both physical and magical attacks. His bone structure had thickened and twisted during transformation, creating what some observers described as swollen joints that possessed strength capable of crushing stone. His hands, according to those who witnessed him closely enough to provide detail, retained a basic humanoid configuration with 5 fingers and opposable thumbs. But each digit had elongated into something more claw than hand. These claws were not merely sharp, but based on accounts of their effects, appeared to be imbued with defiling magic at a fundamental level. Wounds inflicted by Borys's claws aged flesh and caused damage that refused to heal through normal means. His head presented what many accounts describe as the most disturbing aspect of his appearance. The skull had elongated into something between a snout and a human face, retaining just enough recognizable features to suggest the man he had once been, while incorporating elements that marked him as something entirely other. His eyes, described in various accounts as burning with inner fire, were said to inspire overwhelming fear in those who met his gaze. Some witnesses claimed to experience visions of their own deaths when looking directly at the dragon. His mouth, according to descriptions that survived, was filled with rows of fangs designed for rending and tearing. Each tooth was reportedly the length of a dagger and capable of punching through armor and bone with equal ease when he opened his jaws to speak, which accounts suggest he did rarely and only when necessary. The voice that emerged was described as simultaneously his own and something utterly alien, creating sounds that were difficult for mortal minds to fully process. Wings sprouted from his back, and witnesses describe vast leathery appendages that seemed almost too large even for his massive frame. These were not elegant wings, but rather constructs of membrane stretched across frameworks of bone and sinew. When Borys took flight, accounts report that the downdraft from those wings could flatten buildings, and the sound of their beating could be heard for miles across the desert wastes. His tail, described in various encounters, extended behind him for what witnesses estimated was nearly his entire body length. A whip-like appendage tipped with bony protrusions that could be used as a devastating weapon. The tail served purposes beyond merely striking enemies, acting as a counterbalance when he moved and allowing him to execute turns and maneuvers that should have been impossible for a creature of his size. But the physical transformation, horrifying as accounts describe it, represented only the most visible aspect of what Borys had become. His magical abilities had grown exponentially with each stage of dragon metamorphosis. Defiling magic, the practice of draining life force from living things to power spells, came to him with what witnesses described as terrifying ease. He did not need to consciously draw upon the life around him. Based on observations of his spell casting, it happened automatically whenever he wished to work magic. The radius of his defiling had expanded to proportions that left permanent scars on the landscape. When Borys cast a spell of significant power, based on the evidence at sites where he worked major magic, the draining effect could extend for hundreds of feet in all directions, killing every plant, every insect, every microscopic organism within that sphere. The ground itself would turn to ash, becoming so thoroughly dead that nothing would grow there again for generations, if ever. Archaeological evidence confirms he could reduce areas that still had some life, rare as they were, to lifeless wastes with sustained magical working. The spells themselves, according to accounts of his battles and the few who witnessed his power and lived, exceeded in power and scope anything available to ordinary defilers. Borys could work magic that reshaped landscapes, that called down destructive forces from the sky, that opened rifts in reality itself. He had access to knowledge that had been lost to ordinary practitioners, magical understanding preserved from ages past when such secrets were more widely known. His mastery of metamorphic magic, based on what we can infer from his abilities, allowed him to alter his own form when necessary. Though historical records suggest he rarely chose to do so, some accounts mention him appearing in human form on rare occasions, though the magic required to maintain such an illusion would have been considerable, and he apparently saw little point in hiding what he was. When he did assume such forms, accounts suggest it was always temporary and always for specific purposes. But perhaps most terrifying, according to those who witnessed it or heard accounts from survivors, was his ability to drain life force directly, without the intermediary of spell formulae or magical structures. This was an ability inherent to advanced dragon metamorphosis, a power that operated on such a fundamental level that it bypassed most defenses and resistances. Witnesses describe Borys reaching out, either physically or through magical extension, and pulling the vital essence from living beings. Victims would feel their life force being torn away, would watch their own bodies wither and age, would experience every moment of the process before finally collapsing as dried husks. This life draining served multiple purposes based on what we understand. It could be used as a weapon in combat, allowing Borys to eliminate enemies Without expending magical energy, it provided sustenance, feeding him in ways that ordinary food never could. And most importantly, it generated the raw power needed to maintain Rajaat's prison, channeling the stolen life force of the annual levy into the wards and bindings that kept the First Sorcerer trapped. His psionic abilities, according to accounts that reference them, rivaled his magical powers in scope and potency. Borys had been a formidable psionicist even before his transformation, but the dragon metamorphosis apparently amplified his mental capabilities to extraordinary levels. Based on what we understand of his activities, he could project his consciousness across vast distances, observing events in the tablelands from his fortress in Ur Draxa. He could read minds, extracting information from subjects without them even realizing they had been violated. Accounts suggest he could crush the minds of lesser beings with a thought, reducing them to mindless husks. His telekinetic abilities, referenced in various accounts of his power, allowed him to move massive objects without physical contact, to create barriers of pure mental force, to manipulate matter in ways that seemed to defy natural law. Some descriptions mention bolts of psionic energy that struck with tremendous force, zones where normal physical laws ceased to function, and the ability to teleport himself and others across hundreds of miles instantaneously. The death field ability represents one of his most dreaded powers in the accounts that mention it. By focusing his psionic might in a specific area, descriptions suggest Borys could create a zone where living things simply ceased to function. Hearts stopped beating. Brains stopped processing thoughts. Everything within the field died instantly, not from any visible cause, but simply because the psionic energy disrupted the fundamental processes that sustained life. Accounts suggest he could deploy this ability selectively, or unleash it indiscriminately to clear vast areas. His body equilibrium power, based on observations of his movements, allowed him to ignore gravity and environmental conditions that would kill normal beings. Witnesses describe him walking on surfaces that should not support his weight, surviving in environments of extreme conditions, regulating his body to adapt to any situation. This made him virtually impossible to trap or contain through environmental means. The combination of magic and psionics created synergies that, according to those who witnessed his power in action, multiplied Borys's effective capabilities beyond simple addition. He could cast a spell while simultaneously using psionic abilities, attacking on multiple fronts in ways that overwhelmed any defense. He could use psionics to enhance his spells, or use magic to amplify his psionic abilities, creating attacks that defied conventional understanding. His breath weapon deserves special mention, for accounts describe it as unlike anything from ordinary experience. Borys breathed what witnesses describe as superheated sand, a cone of crystalline particles accelerated to incredible velocities and heated to temperatures that could melt stone. This breath combined physical abrasion with thermal damage, shredding and burning simultaneously. The cone expanded as it traveled, and anything caught in its path was scoured down to nothing, reduced to molten slag and ash. Accounts suggest he could unleash this breath weapon multiple times, though he rarely needed to. The threat of it alone was usually sufficient to achieve his purposes, and evidence suggests he had learned that using it tended to destroy everything of value along with his enemies. It was a weapon of last resort, deployed only when he wanted to ensure absolute destruction. His magical resistance, based on accounts of battles against him, operated at levels that made him effectively immune to most spells. Only the most powerful magical workings had any chance of affecting him, and even those required precise execution. Ordinary combat magic simply dissipated against what witnesses described as an aura of power that surrounded him. This resistance was not something he had to actively maintain, but rather a feature of his existence, natural and automatic. His regenerative abilities, referenced in accounts of attempts to harm him, meant that even injuries that did manage to penetrate his defenses healed almost immediately. His body could regrow lost tissue, repair damage, neutralize threats before they could take hold. This made Borys nearly impossible to kill through sustained assault, according to those who understood his nature. Over his long existence, historical records indicate that Borys accumulated artifacts and treasures that would represent immense power. He collected items not merely for their value, but for strategic purposes, ensuring that no one else could use them against him. Magical weapons that could potentially harm him were locked away in his vaults. Artifacts that could enhance dragon transformations were kept under his personal control to prevent the Sorcerer Kings from advancing too quickly. Ancient relics from earlier ages were stored carefully in case they might prove useful. The dark lens itself, the artifact that had been used to transform him and imprison Rajaat, remained in his possession according to historical accounts. He kept it secure within Ur Draxa, protected by wards and guardians. The lens represented too much power to allow anyone else access to it. As long as he controlled it, no one could repeat the ritual that had created him. No one could challenge his supremacy as the only fully realized dragon on Athas. His influence extended across every aspect of Athasian civilization, even in places where his physical presence was never felt. The annual levy shaped the economies and politics of every city-state. The knowledge that the dragon existed, that he watched and could appear without warning, affected every decision the Sorcerer Kings made. They built their cities with defenses that might slow him down. They hoarded power in hopes of one day being strong enough to resist him. They schemed and plotted against each other, but never against him, because they all remembered what happened during his rampage. Trade routes avoided areas where Borys was known to travel. Explorers gave wide berth to regions where his presence had been reported. Entire philosophies and religions developed around the concept of the dragon as an unavoidable force, something to be survived rather than opposed. He was the ultimate authority on Athas, the being to whom even god-kings bowed, the living proof that power had limits and hierarchies that could not be transgressed. Yet for all this power, for all his abilities and influence and accumulated might, what we can infer from his actions suggests that Borys remained haunted by the knowledge of what he had lost. The madness lurked always at the edges of his consciousness, threatening to return if he let his guard down. The memories of his rampage provided constant reminders of how easily he could lose control again, and the thousands of lives he drained every year, necessary as they were to maintain Rajaat's prison, weighed on him in ways that pure power could never assuage. He was the most powerful being on Athas, capable of destroying armies and reshaping landscapes with his magic, but he was also a prisoner of his own nature, trapped in a dragon form that could never fully return to humanity, burdened with responsibilities that would never end, forever vigilant against both external threats and the chaos within his own mind. This was Borys at the height of his power, absolute and terrible and tragic all at once. Section 6. The final stage and ultimate fall. The dragon metamorphosis is not a destination, but a journey with stages that stretch across millennia, even after regaining his sanity. Even after what historical sources suggest was approximately 2,000 years of ruling from Ur Draxa and maintaining Rajaat's prison, Borys had not yet reached the final stage of transformation. Based on what scholars understand of the dragon metamorphosis process, he remained in an advanced, but not complete stage, powerful beyond mortal reckoning, but not yet the fully realized dragon that represented the absolute pinnacle of the transformation. That final stage, the complete and total apotheosis into pure dragon form, still lay ahead of him, requiring more time and more power than even his considerable resources had yet accumulated. You need to understand what achieving that final stage would have meant, based on the knowledge available about dragon transformations. A fully transformed dragon would transcend the limitations that still bound Borys, would become something closer to a force of nature than a living being. The magical and psionic abilities would reach levels where reality itself became malleable, where the dragon's will would impose itself upon the world simply through existence. This was the goal toward which every dragon aspired, the ultimate expression of power that justified all the sacrifices and horrors required to achieve it. What we can infer from Borys' actions suggests he worked steadily toward this goal throughout his reign, carefully accumulating the power and knowledge necessary to advance to the final stage without triggering another bout of madness. He had learned from his original transformation, understood now that rushing the process led to catastrophe. The annual levy provided him with abundant life force, far more than was needed merely to maintain Rajaat's prison. The excess, based on what scholars believe, he channeled into his own continued metamorphosis, advancing incrementally through the remaining stages that separated him from complete transformation. The changes occurring within him, though not directly observable by others, would have been ongoing. His physical form would have continued to shift, becoming more draconic with each passing year. His magical abilities would have expanded into new territories. His psionic powers would have reached heights where he could affect events through pure thought. The connection between his consciousness and the fundamental forces of magic would have grown stronger, more intimate, until spell casting became as natural as breathing had once been. But this gradual advancement toward ultimate power created a vulnerability he apparently did not fully recognize until too late. The final stage of dragon transformation, based on what is understood about the process, would have required a commitment of resources and attention so complete that even brief distractions could prove catastrophic. Borys would have needed to focus entirely on his metamorphosis for an extended period, reducing his other activities to the minimum necessary to prevent collapse of the order he had established. And that meant his vigilance over Rajaat's prison, while still maintained, could not be as absolute as it had been previously. The events that would lead to his downfall began in the city of Tyr, the city-state that had given him his most common title, even though he had never directly ruled it. Historical records confirm that Kalak, the sorcerer king of Tyr, had grown ambitious beyond his capacity for caution. He too sought to accelerate his own dragon transformation, to achieve in years what should take centuries. To power this accelerated metamorphosis, accounts indicate that Kalak planned to construct a massive ziggurat and perform a ritual that would drain the life force of Tyr's entire population in a single catastrophic working. You might expect Borys to have intervened directly, to have appeared in Tyr and destroyed Kalak for attempting such a thing without permission. But based on what we can piece together, the dragon of Tyr was deep in his own transformation process, approaching the threshold of the final stage, and could not spare the attention required for such direct action. What evidence exists suggests he was aware of Kalak's plans, monitored the situation through his networks, but calculated that the risk of intervention exceeded the risk of allowing events to proceed. That calculation proved both correct and catastrophically wrong. Historical records confirm that Kalak was indeed stopped, not by Borys, but by a group of individuals who would come to play central roles in the catastrophe that followed. A gladiator named Rickus, a sorceress called Sadira, who had learned to draw power from the sun itself rather than from life force, a Templar named Augiz, who turned against his master, and others whose names were recorded in the accounts of that time. They assassinated Kalak and destroyed his ziggurat before the ritual could be completed, preventing the genocide he had planned. But the assassination of a sorcerer king sent ripples throughout the power structure of the Tablelands. Tyr declared itself a free city, abolished slavery within its walls, and set in motion social changes that threatened the stability Borys had maintained for millennia. More dangerously, the heroes who had killed Kalak discovered secrets about the true nature of the Sorcerer Kings, about the cleansing wars, about Rajaat and the dragon transformation. Knowledge that had been carefully hoarded and hidden began to spread, reaching those who should never have heard it. Among those who learned these secrets was Tithian, a Templar of Tyr who managed to seize power in the chaos following Kalak's death. Historical accounts describe Tithian as ambitious, cunning, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of power. He discovered the location of the Dark Lens, learned that it was kept in Ur Draxa under Borys' protection, and conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. He would steal the Dark Lens and use it to transform himself, to claim power equal to those who had betrayed Rajaat millennia ago. The theft of the Dark Lens represented a crisis of the first magnitude. This artifact had been used to transform Borys into a dragon, had been the focus for imprisoning Rajaat, and remained the single most powerful magical item on Athas. In the wrong hands, it could reshape the world or destroy it entirely. What accounts suggest is that Borys emerged from his transformative focus, fury and alarm gripping him as he realized what had happened. He had been so focused on achieving the final stage of metamorphosis that his defenses against theft, wards, and guardians he had considered impregnable had been circumvented through a combination of factors he had not anticipated. He pursued the thieves with what records indicate was single-minded intensity, bringing the full weight of his power to bear on recovering the Dark Lens before it could be used for purposes that might destabilize everything he had worked to maintain. But events were accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control them. Tithian, according to historical accounts, manipulated by forces he did not fully understand, began working to weaken the wards on Rajaat's prison. He believed, wrongly, that he could use the Dark Lens to claim power for himself, not understanding that the First Sorcerer was far too dangerous to be approached in such a manner. You stand witness to the unraveling of an age, the collapse of an order that had persisted for approximately 2,000 years. The prison wards, already stressed by Borys' divided attention, began to fail under Tithian's meddling. What we can infer is that Borys felt it happening, sensed the bonds loosening that held the most dangerous being in existence. He abandoned his pursuit of the Dark Lens, teleported directly to the prison site, and threw every scrap of his power into reinforcing the failing wards. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and Rajaat, the First Sorcerer, the architect of the cleansing wars, began to break free from his millennial imprisonment. The confrontation between Borys and Rajaat was not a battle in any conventional sense, according to what fragmentary accounts exist. These were beings whose power exceeded anything that could be measured in ordinary terms. When they clashed, accounts suggest that reality itself buckled under the strain. The magical energies unleashed were sufficient to alter the landscape for miles around, to create permanent scars that would never fully heal. Borys fought with everything he possessed, every spell and psionic power and physical ability honed over thousands of years of existence. But he faced an opponent who had created him, who understood the dragon transformation more intimately than anyone else could, who had spent 2,000 years imprisoned with nothing to do but think and plan and nurture his hatred for those who had betrayed him. Rajaat had weaknesses, vulnerabilities that imprisonment had imposed upon him, but based on what we understand, he also possessed advantages that Borys could not overcome. The First Sorcerer knew exactly how to hurt a dragon, knew precisely which defenses could be bypassed, and which attacks would prove most effective. The battle raged across the area of the prison, across the wastes surrounding it. What accounts exist suggest that Borys landed blows that would have destroyed cities, unleashed magic that should have unmade any opponent. Rajaat absorbed the damage, turned it aside, struck back with power that even the dragon of Tyr could barely withstand. The regeneration that had made Borys nearly unkillable in every previous conflict met its match against magic, specifically designed to counter it. His scales, harder than metal, cracked under assaults that ignored physical durability entirely. And slowly, according to the accounts that survived, Borys began to lose. He was powerful, the most powerful being on Athas besides Rajaat himself, but he was not powerful enough. The final stage of dragon transformation that would have elevated him to levels where he might have matched the First Sorcerer remained incomplete, just barely out of reach. If he had achieved it, if he had been given more time to complete his metamorphosis, the outcome might have been different. But time had run out, and Borys faced his death with what we can only imagine was the bitter knowledge that he had come so close to the power that might have saved him. Historical records confirm that Rajaat did not kill him quickly or mercifully. The First Sorcerer had millennia of imprisonment to avenge, betrayal to repay, and the Butcher of Dwarves had been instrumental in that betrayal. The attack that finally brought Borys down did not simply end his life. Based on what witnesses described, it unmade him, tore apart the magical and psionic energies that held his dragon form together, ripped away the power he had accumulated over thousands of years. Borys died not merely as a being, but as a fundamental presence in the world, his existence being erased in ways that transcended mere physical death. In his final moments, what thoughts passed through Borys's mind remain unknowable. Perhaps he experienced something that might have been clarity, or perhaps merely the random patterns of a consciousness dissolving. He had lived for thousands of years, had been a man, a champion, a conspirator, a dragon, a madman, a ruler. He had slaughtered dwarves by the millions during the cleansing wars. He had betrayed his creator. He had raged across Athas in centuries of madness, killing millions more. He had ruled through fear and annual sacrifice for 2 millennia. He had thought himself purposeful, had believed that maintaining Rajaat's prison justified his actions, that preventing the resumption of the cleansing wars made him something more than another monster. But in the end, he had failed even at that. Rajaat was free, and every death Borys had caused, every life he had drained, every horror he had perpetrated or permitted, seemed in that moment to have been for nothing. The dragon of Tyr died there in the wastes beyond the sea of silt, his massive body collapsing as the magic that sustained it dissipated. The death of such a powerful being did not go unnoticed. Across Athas, those sensitive to magical energies felt a disturbance, a sudden absence where an overwhelming presence had existed moments before. The sorcerer kings, in their various cities, sensed it immediately and understood what it meant. The dragon was dead, and the order he had imposed was gone with him. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Rajaat, freed from his prison, began to move against Athas according to his original vision. The cleansing wars would resume, and this time they would be prosecuted with the full power of the First Sorcerer unleashed. The heroes who had inadvertently enabled his escape now faced the task of somehow stopping a being that even Borys could not defeat. The sorcerer kings, no longer held in check by the dragon's dominance, turned their attention to the crisis, but found themselves woefully unprepared for what they faced. But Borys's death had consequences beyond the immediate crisis. The annual levy ended, and thousands of slaves who would have died that year lived instead. The cities of the tablelands, no longer required to provide tribute to Ur Draxa, found themselves with resources they had not possessed before. The fear that had dominated Athasian civilization for approximately 2 millennia began to lift, replaced by different fears perhaps, but at least offering the possibility of something new. The legacy Borys left behind was complex and contradictory. He had been a mass murderer on scales that defied comprehension, responsible for genocides during the cleansing wars and millions more deaths during his rampage and through the annual levies. He had ruled through fear and force, maintaining order through the constant threat of overwhelming violence. He had been a tyrant whose very existence cast a shadow over an entire world. Yet he had also prevented something potentially worse. For approximately 2,000 years, Rajaat remained imprisoned, unable to resume the cleansing wars, unable to finish the genocides he had begun. Whatever one might say about Borys's methods, about the horrors he inflicted, and the suffering he caused, he had succeeded in his primary purpose for most of his existence. The world he ruled was terrible, but it might have been worse under Rajaat's direct control. The heroes who eventually managed to re-imprison Rajaat, according to historical accounts, did so using methods and knowledge that would not have been available without the time Borys had purchased through his vigilance. The defiling magic that had nearly destroyed Athas began to be countered by preserving magic and sun magic. innovations that arose partly in response to the ecological collapse that defiling had caused, the social changes that began in Tyr, the questioning of systems that had seemed eternal and unchangeable created conditions where new possibilities could emerge. What Borys himself would have thought about such legacy considerations remains unknowable. He had been a creature of purpose, defined entirely by his role as Rajaat's jailer and the tableland's supreme power. His thoughts in his final moments, if they could be known, likely centered on his failure to complete his transformation, on his inability to prevent Rajaat's escape, on what must have seemed the futility of his millennia of effort. He died believing he had failed, and by the metrics he would have used to measure success, he had. But failure and success in such matters are rarely as simple as they appear in the moment. What we can say with certainty is that Borys bought time for Athas, time that the world used to develop tools and knowledge capable of facing threats that would have destroyed it in earlier eras. His rule, harsh and terrible as it was, provided a stability that allowed civilizations to persist when they might otherwise have been ground to dust. And his death, while representing the collapse of an established order, removed an obstacle to change that had become insurmountable, allowing the world to move forward rather than remaining frozen in a terrible status quo. The story of Borys, the Dragon of Tyr, serves as a reminder of how easily purpose can become indistinguishable from atrocity, how the best intentions can lead to the worst outcomes, how power without wisdom leads inevitably to catastrophe. He began as a man chosen for his potential, transformed into a weapon designed to commit genocide, became a conspirator who thought he could build something better, achieved power beyond mortal comprehension, and died, having failed to prevent the very thing he had dedicated his existence to stopping. His life spanned millennia and touched every aspect of Athasian civilization, leaving scars that persist long after his death. You have walked with him now, from his selection by Rajaat through his transformation and madness, and rule to his ultimate defeat and death. You have seen the butcher of dwarves, the dragon of Tyr, the supreme power of Athas in all his terrible glory and tragic failure. His story is written in blood and ash across the face of a dying world, a cautionary tale about the nature of power and the price of wielding it. Remember it, learn from it, and understand that even the mightiest can fall, that even the most carefully maintained order must eventually give way to change, and that the end of one age, no matter how terrible that age was, always creates space for something new to begin. If you enjoyed learning about Borys, the Dragon of Tyr, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless other stories waiting to be told, deep lore from the world of Athas and beyond, mysteries to explore and legends to uncover. Thank you for listening, and may your own journey through the worlds of imagination be as rich and complex as the tales we share here.